The GPS coordinates flashed on the Coast Guard screen: 41°14N, 69°57W. 300 miles southeast of Cape Cod, in waters where merchant ships pass like ghosts in the night and private vessels are as rare as shooting stars. When the helicopter crew spotted the tiny sailboat bobbing in 12-foot swells, they expected to find either a corpse or an empty hull. What they discovered instead would rewrite everything the maritime world thought it knew about human endurance, obsession, and the thin line between genius and madness. The boat was barely larger than a dinghy, 10 feet of fiberglass that had no business being more than a few miles from shore, let alone attempting one of the most dangerous ocean crossings on Earth. But there it was, battered by weeks of North Atlantic fury, its miniature mast bent but not broken, its hull somehow still intact. And inside, against all odds and every law of physics and common sense, was Thomas Whitman, alive, conscious, and completely transformed into something the rescue team had never encountered in 30 years of maritime emergencies. This isn't just another survival story. It's a psychological descent into the mind of a man who pushed the boundaries of human possibility so far that reality itself seemed to bend around his will. What the Coast Guard found that day challenges everything we think we know about solo ocean crossings, about the limits of the human spirit, and about what happens when preparation meets madness in the middle of the world's most unforgiving ocean. The story begins not with the rescue, but with a man whose entire life had been building toward this single, impossible moment. Thomas Whitman wasn't your typical weekend sailor dreaming of adventure. He was a 47-year-old mechanical engineer from Portland, Maine, whose obsession with small boat ocean crossings had consumed him for over a decade. Where most men his age were settling into comfortable routines of mortgage payments and retirement planning, Thomas was methodically designing what he believed would be the smallest vessel ever to successfully cross the Atlantic Ocean under sail. His colleagues at the shipyard where he worked knew him as meticulous, brilliant, and increasingly distant. His ex-wife, Sarah, would later tell investigators that Thomas had become a stranger living in our house. Someone who spent every free moment either reading accounts of solo ocean crossings or locked in his garage, working on modifications to his impossible boat. Their divorce papers, filed just 6 months before his departure, cited irreconcilable differences. But friends knew the truth was simpler and more devastating. Thomas had chosen the ocean over everything else in his life. The boat itself was a marvel of engineering miniaturization. Thomas had started with a standard 10-foot sailing dinghy and spent 3 years transforming it into something that existed nowhere in any maritime manual. Every inch served multiple purposes. The cockpit, barely large enough for a man to lie down, contained a fold-out sleeping platform that doubled as storage for his emergency supplies. The tiny cabin, accessed through a hatch that forced even Thomas to contort his lean frame, housed a complex array of navigation equipment, water purification systems, and enough dried food to last 6 weeks. But it was the modifications no one could see that revealed the true depth of Thomas's obsession. He had reinforced every joint in the hull with aircraft-grade epoxy resin. He had replaced every standard fitting with custom-machined stainless steel components designed to withstand forces that would tear apart boats twice his size. The sail plan, which he had calculated and recalculated hundreds of times, was a masterpiece of aerodynamic efficiency that could drive the tiny boat at speeds that defied its waterline length. Thomas had test-sailed the boat extensively in the waters off Maine, taking it out in conditions that sent experienced sailors running for harbor. Harbor masters would watch in amazement as the tiny vessel carved through 8-foot seas, with Thomas hunched over the tiller, his face a mask of concentration and something approaching religious fervor. He documented everything: wind speeds, wave heights, boat speed, compass headings, even his own physical and mental responses to extended periods alone at sea. The preparation phase revealed a man who understood exactly what he was attempting. Thomas had read every account of small boat Atlantic crossings he could find, from Captain John Voss's epic journey in a dugout canoe to more recent attempts in purpose-built mini-vessels. He had studied weather patterns, shipping lanes, and ocean currents with the intensity of a doctoral student. He even spent 3 months training with a sports psychologist who specialized in helping extreme athletes manage isolation and stress. His departure from Portland Harbor on June 15th was witnessed by fewer than a dozen people. Thomas had deliberately avoided publicity, knowing that media attention would bring unwanted scrutiny from the Coast Guard and maritime authorities, who would almost certainly try to stop what they would see as a suicide mission. The few friends who came to see him off described a man who seemed utterly calm and focused, someone who had made peace with whatever fate awaited him in the Atlantic. Sarah was not among them. She would later say that watching Thomas sail away in that ridiculous toy boat would have been more than she could bear. But she had tracked his preparations obsessively, torn between terror for his safety and a grudging admiration for his unwavering commitment to an impossible dream. He wasn't trying to kill himself, she would tell reporters weeks later. He was trying to prove something that only he understood. The first week at sea proceeded exactly as Thomas had planned. His daily radio check-ins with a friend in Portland revealed steady progress eastward, with the boat performing better than even his optimistic projections had suggested. He was averaging nearly 4 knots, an extraordinary speed for such a small vessel, and his reports were filled with technical details about sail trim, weather patterns, and navigation fixes that demonstrated complete competence and control. But it was during the second week that the first subtle changes began to appear in his radio transmissions. Thomas had always been precise in his communications, delivering information in the clipped, technical language of his engineering background. Now, however, his reports began to include observations that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. He described the ocean as breathing around his boat, talked about conversations with seabirds that landed on his tiny deck, and began referring to his vessel not by its registered name, Minimalist, but as she, as if the boat had somehow developed its own personality. His friend in Portland, Mike Chen, a fellow engineer who had helped Thomas with some of the boat's modifications, initially dismissed these changes as the natural effects of isolation and sleep deprivation. Solo sailors often reported similar experiences during extended passages, and Thomas was still providing accurate position reports and weather observations that indicated his navigation and seamanship remained sharp. It was during the third week that everything changed. The weather system that would test Thomas beyond anything he had prepared for began forming 800 miles to his southwest, a tropical depression that meteorologists were tracking with growing concern. By the time it had organized into what would become Hurricane Elena, Thomas was directly in its projected path, sailing a tiny boat through waters where even large vessels would seek shelter. His final radio transmission before the storm hit would be analyzed by maritime psychologists for years afterward. Speaking in a voice that Mike Chen described as unnaturally calm, almost euphoric, Thomas reported winds building to 30 knots and seas approaching 12 feet. But instead of expressing concern or discussing his plans for riding out the storm, he seemed almost excited by the approaching challenge. "The boat wants this," he said, his voice crackling through atmospheric interference. "She's been waiting for this test her entire life. We both have." Then for 9 days, silence. The Coast Guard launched their search on the 4th day of radio silence, deploying aircraft and coordinating with merchant vessels in the area. The mathematical reality was stark. A 10-foot boat in hurricane conditions had virtually no chance of survival. Search parameters were calculated based on debris fields and body recovery rather than rescue scenarios. Everyone involved understood they were almost certainly looking for wreckage and remains, not survivors. When the C-130 crew spotted the tiny white sail on the morning of the 9th day, the pilot actually circled twice before believing what he was seeing. The boat was not only still afloat, it was making way under sail, cutting through moderate seas as if nothing had happened. As they descended for a closer look, they could see a figure in the cockpit, someone who raised an arm to wave at the aircraft as if greeting a neighbor across a backyard fence. The helicopter crew that was dispatched for the rescue would later describe the scene as surreal and impossible. The boat showed obvious signs of having endured extreme conditions. Gouges in the fiberglass hull, torn sail patches, rigging that had been jury-rigged with spare line. But it was fundamentally intact and seaworthy. More shocking still was the condition of Thomas Whitman himself. Paramedic Jennifer Rodriguez, who was lowered to the tiny boat on a rescue basket, found a man who bore little resemblance to the careful engineer who had left Portland 3 weeks earlier. Thomas had lost at least 30 pounds, his face gaunt and weathered to the color of old leather. His hands were masses of cuts and salt sores, his hair bleached white by sun and spray. But his eyes, that's what Rodriguez would remember most clearly. His eyes held the intensity that seemed to burn with its own light. He didn't want to be rescued, Rodriguez would later testify at the Coast Guard hearing. He kept saying the crossing wasn't finished, that he was so close to understanding. It took 3 of us to convince him to leave the boat. He kept talking to it, apologizing to it, promising he would come back. The physical examination conducted aboard the Coast Guard cutter revealed a man who had pushed his body to the absolute limits of human endurance. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, and saltwater sores covered his skin like a map of suffering. But it was the psychological evaluation that raised the most questions. Thomas was lucid and coherent, able to recall his position, the date, and detailed technical information about his boat's performance. Yet he insisted on referring to the vessel as a living being, claimed to have had extended conversations with various sea creatures, and expressed absolute certainty that he had been chosen for some greater purpose that his rescue had interrupted. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the psychiatrist who examined Thomas, would later write that she had encountered something unprecedented in maritime psychology. He exhibited all the classic symptoms of severe isolation-induced psychosis, she noted in her report, yet retained complete technical competence and navigational awareness. It was as if 2 completely different minds were occupying the same body, one rational and highly skilled, the other completely divorced from consensus reality. The boat's recovery provided even more puzzling evidence. When Coast Guard divers examined the tiny vessel, they found modifications that Thomas had never mentioned to anyone, changes that seemed to have been made during the crossing itself. Additional through-hull fittings had been sealed with what appeared to be a mixture of epoxy and organic materials that laboratory analysis could never definitively identify. The hull itself showed stress patterns that marine engineers said should have resulted in catastrophic failure, yet somehow the structure had not only held together but seemed to have become stronger. Most mysterious of all was Thomas's logbook, a detailed record he had kept throughout the crossing. The entries began in his characteristic precise handwriting, documenting weather conditions, navigation fixes, and technical observations with scientific accuracy. But as the pages progressed, the handwriting began to change, becoming more flowing, more artistic, almost calligraphic in style. The content shifted as well, moving from technical observations to poetic descriptions of his relationship with the ocean, philosophical meditations on solitude and human purpose, and increasingly detailed accounts of conversations with what he called the voices of the deep. The final entries, written during and after the hurricane, were unlike anything in maritime literature. Thomas described the storm not as a battle to be survived, but as a communion with forces that most humans never experienced. He wrote about the boat becoming an extension of his own body, about understanding the language of wind and waves on a cellular level, about achieving a state of consciousness that he claimed was the real reason for his journey. The crossing was never about proving boat design or seamanship, he wrote in an entry dated 3 days after the hurricane had passed. It was about discovering what happens when a human being strips away everything that separates them from the elemental forces of existence. I have found something out here that cannot be brought back to shore. It can only be lived. The Coast Guard investigation that followed Thomas's rescue would ultimately raise more questions than it answered. By every measurable standard, his crossing should have been impossible. The boat was too small, the conditions too severe, and the duration too long for any reasonable expectation of survival. Yet not only had he survived, he had maintained course toward his destination with an accuracy that suggested either extraordinary skill or some form of guidance that defied rational explanation. Maritime engineers who examined Thomas's modifications to the boat found innovations that pushed the boundaries of small craft design. His method of reinforcing critical stress points, his custom sail plan, and his water management systems all represented advances that the industry would later adopt for legitimate small boat construction. Whatever had driven Thomas to attempt his impossible crossing had also driven him to genuine technical breakthroughs that would benefit future generations of sailors. But it was the psychological dimension of Thomas's journey that proved most challenging to understand. In the months following his rescue, he underwent extensive evaluation by specialists in maritime psychology, extreme environment adaptation, and isolation-induced mental states. The consensus that emerged was both fascinating and troubling. Thomas appeared to have achieved a level of human-ocean integration that existed at the very edge of sanity. A state that allowed him to survive conditions that would have killed anyone operating within normal psychological parameters. Dr. James Hartwell, a researcher who had studied solo sailors for over 20 years, would later write that Thomas's case represented a form of adaptive psychosis that may be essential for survival in extreme isolation environments. The human mind, when pushed beyond its normal operating limits, sometimes develops coping mechanisms that appear pathological but may actually represent a higher form of environmental integration. The question that haunted everyone involved in Thomas's case was whether his psychological transformation had been the cause of his survival or its result. Had he set out to achieve this altered state, or had it emerged as a byproduct of his extreme circumstances? Thomas himself, when questioned by investigators, was maddeningly vague on this crucial point. He claimed to have hoped for transformation, but insisted that the specific nature of his experience had been beyond anything I could have imagined or planned. The boat itself became something of a mystery artifact. After its recovery, maritime museums and research institutions competed to acquire what was already being called the smallest vessel ever to survive a North Atlantic hurricane. But Thomas refused all offers to sell or donate the craft. Instead, he had it transported back to Maine, where he installed it in a specially constructed shed behind his house, treating it with a reverence that bordered on worship. Neighbors reported seeing Thomas spending hours in the shed, sitting beside the boat and carrying on what appeared to be one-sided conversations. When questioned about these sessions, Thomas would only say that he was maintaining the connection and ensuring that the boat understood why their journey together had been interrupted. Local psychological services reached out repeatedly, concerned about Thomas's apparent inability to readjust to life on land, but he consistently declined their offers of assistance. The maritime community's response to Thomas's achievement was complicated and often contradictory. Traditional sailing organizations struggled to acknowledge a crossing that violated so many established principles of seamanship and safety. How could they celebrate someone who had succeeded by ignoring virtually every rule they taught? Yet the undeniable fact remained that Thomas had accomplished something that experts had declared impossible, using innovations and techniques that pushed the boundaries of small boat design. Some veteran sailors privately admitted that Thomas had achieved something they had dreamed of, but never dared attempt. Captain Maria Santos, who had completed multiple solo Atlantic crossings in conventional boats, would later write that Thomas had accessed something that all of us who spend significant time alone at sea recognize but rarely discuss: the point where the boundaries between sailor and sea begin to dissolve. Most of us step back from that edge. Thomas dove headfirst into it and somehow found a way to survive the experience. The technical maritime press struggled with how to cover Thomas's story. On one hand, his innovations in small boat design were genuinely significant and deserved documentation. On the other hand, his methods and motivations were so far outside normal parameters that featuring his work might encourage other sailors to attempt similarly dangerous crossings. The compromise that emerged was a series of articles that focused on Thomas's engineering solutions, while carefully avoiding any details that might serve as a how-to guide for would-be imitators. Thomas himself seemed largely indifferent to the attention his crossing generated. When journalists sought interviews, he would speak readily about the technical aspects of his boat modifications, but became evasive and almost mystical when asked about his experiences during the crossing itself. He would describe his time at sea in language that sounded more like religious testimony than nautical reporting, speaking of dialogues with elemental forces and understanding the ocean's true voice in ways that left his listeners uncertain whether they were hearing profound insight or elaborate delusion. The psychological effects of Thomas's crossing continued to manifest months after his rescue. Friends and family members reported that he seemed to be living in two worlds simultaneously, able to function normally in day-to-day interactions while remaining fundamentally changed in ways that were difficult to define. His ex-wife, Sarah, despite their divorce, found herself drawn back into Thomas's orbit, fascinated and disturbed by the transformation she witnessed in him. He was still Thomas, she would later explain, but there was something else there too, something that hadn't existed before his crossing. It was like he had brought back a piece of the ocean with him, and it was still alive inside him. Their relationship, which had ended in bitterness over Thomas's obsession with his sailing project, evolved into something neither of them could fully understand. A connection based not on romance or shared domestic goals, but on Sarah's gradual recognition that Thomas had experienced something that placed him beyond conventional categories of understanding. The question of what Thomas had actually discovered during his crossing became the subject of speculation and debate in fields far removed from sailing. Researchers in extreme psychology, consciousness studies, and even theoretical physics found aspects of his account that resonated with their own work on the nature of human perception and the limits of individual consciousness. Some suggested that Thomas's experience represented a form of breakthrough in human environment integration that might have applications for space exploration, deep-sea research, or other extreme environment challenges. Dr. Susan Crawford, a researcher in altered states of consciousness at Johns Hopkins University, conducted a series of interviews with Thomas over the course of 6 months following his rescue. Her conclusion, published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, suggested that Thomas had achieved a functional dissolution of the subject-object distinction that allowed him to process environmental information in ways that transcended normal sensory limitations. Whether this represents a pathological state or an adaptive breakthrough may depend entirely on the context in which it occurs. The boat continued to exert a powerful influence over Thomas's life. He began making modifications to the shed where it was housed, installing windows that provided a view of the ocean and creating what he called a proper environment for the vessel. Visitors to his property reported that the shed had taken on the characteristics of a shrine, with Thomas having arranged his navigation equipment, charts from the crossing, and various artifacts from his time at sea in patterns that suggested ritualistic significance. But it was Thomas's behavior during storms that most clearly revealed the depth of his transformation. Neighbors reported that whenever severe weather threatened the Maine coast, Thomas would disappear into his shed and remain there for the duration of the storm, emerging only after the winds had died down and the seas had calmed. When questioned about these vigils, Thomas would explain that he was translating the storm's message for the boat, ensuring that it understood the nature of the weather system and didn't feel abandoned or forgotten. Local meteorologist David Kim became fascinated by Thomas's apparent ability to predict weather changes with uncanny accuracy. He would call me days before our computer models showed significant weather developing, Kim later recalled. His predictions were consistently more accurate than our professional forecasts, particularly for storm intensity and duration. When I asked him about his methods, he would just say he was listening to what the ocean was saying. I started paying attention to his predictions, and they were right so often that I began incorporating his input into my own forecasts. The one-year anniversary of Thomas's rescue passed without fanfare, but those who knew him noticed a subtle change in his demeanor. He began speaking more frequently about unfinished business and expressing regret about his premature rescue. When friends asked what he meant, Thomas would explain that his crossing had been interrupted just as he was beginning to understand the real purpose of his journey. The implication that he might attempt another crossing sent waves of concern through his personal network and drew the attention of Coast Guard officials who had been monitoring his psychological state. Dr. Morrison, the psychiatrist who had evaluated Thomas immediately after his rescue, was called in to assess his mental state and determine whether he posed a danger to himself or others. Her evaluation revealed a man who remained psychologically stable by conventional measures, but who had developed what she termed an alternative relationship with reality that made him potentially unpredictable in maritime situations. Thomas has constructed a comprehensive worldview that places his ocean crossing at the center of a larger narrative about human potential and environmental connection, she wrote in her updated assessment. Within this framework, his actions appear logical and purposeful. The concern is that this framework operates according to principles that may not align with conventional safety considerations or social responsibilities. The Coast Guard's response to Thomas's potential plans for another crossing revealed the complex legal and ethical issues surrounding extreme solo sailing attempts. While no law prevented a competent adult from attempting dangerous ocean crossings, the resources required for search and rescue operations gave maritime authorities a legitimate interest in discouraging such attempts. The compromise that emerged involved Thomas agreeing to a series of psychological evaluations and safety consultations in exchange for the Coast Guard's agreement not to actively interfere with any future sailing plans he might develop. These consultations revealed the sophisticated reasoning behind Thomas's desire to return to sea. He had spent months analyzing his first crossing, identifying what he called incomplete data collection and interrupted protocol sequences that had prevented him from achieving his full objectives. His descriptions of these objectives remained frustratingly vague, mixing technical sailing terminology with mystical language about oceanic consciousness and elemental communication protocols that left his evaluators uncertain whether they were hearing genuine insights or elaborate rationalization for what amounted to a sophisticated suicide attempt. The boat itself underwent modifications during this period that reflected Thomas's evolving understanding of his experience. Working entirely alone in his shed, he made changes to the hull configuration, sail plan, and interior systems that represented refinements of the innovations that had enabled his survival during the first crossing. Marine engineers, who were granted access to examine his work, found modifications that pushed small boat design even further into uncharted territory. He had essentially created a vessel that existed at the intersection of advanced engineering and something approaching magic, wrote naval architect Robert Chen, Mike's cousin, who documented Thomas's modifications for a professional journal. The mathematical principles behind his hull reinforcements were sound, but the execution incorporated materials and techniques that seemed to emerge from some form of intuitive understanding that went beyond conventional marine engineering education. The most significant modification was Thomas's installation of what he called a communication array, a system of through-hull sensors and above-deck receivers that he claimed would allow him to maintain dialogue with oceanic systems during future crossings. The array's design incorporated elements of standard marine electronics with custom modifications that served no apparent function according to conventional understanding of maritime communication systems. When questioned about the array's purpose, Thomas would explain that his first crossing had taught him that the ocean was actively communicating through patterns of wave action, current flow, and atmospheric pressure changes that could be detected and interpreted by properly designed equipment. His modifications were intended to enhance his ability to receive and process these communications, allowing him to achieve a level of environmental integration that would make future crossings not only safer but more productive in terms of the data he could collect. The scientific community's response to Thomas's theories was divided between fascination and skepticism. Researchers in marine biology and oceanography found some of his observations about ocean behavior patterns to be remarkably accurate, suggesting that his time at sea had provided him with insights that were valid, even if his explanations for how he had acquired them seemed implausible. Others dismissed his communication theories as elaborate delusions that happened to incorporate enough genuine knowledge to appear credible to non-specialists. Dr. Rachel Foster, a marine biologist who had studied whale communication patterns for over a decade, found Thomas's descriptions of oceanic language to be surprisingly sophisticated. He described wave patterns and current interactions using terminology that suggested a deep understanding of fluid dynamics, she noted. Whether his interpretation of these patterns as communication is accurate is another question entirely, but his observational data was remarkably precise. As the second anniversary of his crossing approached, Thomas began making preparations that suggested he was indeed planning another attempt. He had his boat moved from the shed to a marine railway where he could conduct what he called final optimizations to its design. Neighbors reported increased activity around his property, with deliveries of specialized materials and equipment that suggested serious preparation for an extended voyage. The psychological evaluations conducted during this period revealed a man who had achieved a remarkable degree of internal consistency regarding his plans and motivations. Thomas was able to discuss the technical aspects of his projected crossing with complete lucidity while maintaining his mystical interpretation of its larger significance. Dr. Morrison noted that he had integrated his extraordinary experience into a functional worldview that allows him to operate effectively in both conventional and extreme environments. But it was Thomas's final conversation with his ex-wife, Sarah, that provided the clearest insight into his true motivations. During a dinner at her house, their first extended private conversation since his rescue, Thomas spoke openly about what he hoped to achieve through another crossing. "I found something out there," he told her, his voice carrying the same intensity she remembered from their early years together. "Something that exists at the boundary between human consciousness and oceanic systems. The first crossing was just the beginning. I barely touched the surface of what's possible. There's an entire realm of experience that opens up when you push beyond the normal limits of human-ocean interaction." Sarah's response, as she would later recount to investigators, revealed her own transformation during the 2 years since Thomas's return. "I found myself believing him," she said. "Not the technical details, I don't understand any of that, but the essential truth of what he was saying. He had found something out there that changed him at a fundamental level, and he needed to go back to complete whatever process had been started." Udil, the question of whether Thomas would actually attempt another crossing remained unanswered as he continued his preparations. Maritime authorities maintained their surveillance of his activities while avoiding direct interference that might precipitate a confrontation. The sailing community watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as Thomas methodically prepared for what everyone understood might be his final voyage. The boat, now heavily modified and bearing little resemblance to the original 10-foot dinghy that had somehow survived a North Atlantic hurricane, represented the physical manifestation of Thomas's extraordinary journey into the unknown territories of human potential and oceanic mystery. Whether it would carry him to new discoveries or to his final resting place remained the question that haunted everyone who had followed his story. In the end, Thomas Whitman's crossing of the Atlantic in a 10-foot sailboat had become something far more significant than a record-breaking voyage or a survival story. It had become a profound inquiry into the nature of human consciousness, the limits of individual experience, and the possibility that our relationship with the natural world might be far more complex and mysterious than conventional wisdom suggested. The man they found bobbing in the North Atlantic swells that day had been transformed by his encounter with forces that exist at the very edge of human understanding. Whether that transformation represented a breakthrough or a breakdown might ultimately depend on whether Thomas could find a way to integrate his extraordinary experience into a life that remained anchored to the solid ground of everyday reality. But as he continued his preparations for another crossing, it became increasingly clear that Thomas had moved beyond such conventional categories. He had become something unprecedented in maritime history, a navigator of the unknown territories that exist where human consciousness encounters the infinite mystery of the sea. Whether he would return from his next journey into those territories remained the question that would define not only his own fate, but our understanding of what might be possible when human determination meets the ultimate test of oceanic immensity. The story of Thomas Whitman and his impossible crossing stands as a testament to the power of human obsession, the mysteries that still exist in our relationship with the natural world, and the thin line between genius and madness that runs through all great explorations into the unknown. They found him, alive and transformed, in a tiny boat that had no business surviving the North Atlantic's fury. But what they really found was proof that the human spirit, when pushed to its absolute limits, might be capable of achievements that challenge everything we think we know about the boundaries of possibility.